So much. Former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army Van Hill.
U.S. military officials say U.S. and British warplanes on patrol
road to war because bioweapons are so hard to find.
Hello, I'm Peter Coyote, and welcome to the Active Opposition and to tonight's show, Iraq, the Campaign for Hearts and Minds. As the Bush administration presses its case for war, its first task is to win the hearts and minds of the American people and the world community. The Bush administration's arguments, echoed by most, if not all, major national media outlets, fall into three often intermixed categories that will be the subject of this evening's show. We call them respectively the politics of fear, hope, and compassion. Our task tonight on the Active Opposition will be to apply our panel of experts to untangle the emotional from the factual, the spin from the reality, to help us better understand the real issues and the true nature of the impending crisis. I'd like to welcome my guests, please. In Washington, D.C., Professor Abdul Aziz Saeed. He's the Senior Ranking Professor of International Relations at American University School of International Service, the director and founder of the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program. He's created many educational, research, and outreach programs, including Islamic Peace Studies, the Center for Cooperative Global Development, and courses in the theory of international relations, multinational relations, human rights, drug politics, and democracy. He's a member of the White House Committee on the Islamic World, a participant in the Arab-Israeli peace dialogues, and a consultant to the United Nations Development Program. Next to him is Dana Priest, award-winning journalist for the Washington Post since 1995. She's written about U.S. military as the Post's Pentagon correspondent and currently as an investigative reporter. For her new book, The Mission, Waging War and Keeping Peace with America's Military, she traveled to 18 countries and spoke with generals, admirals, special forces A-teams, and infantry troops. She's covered Operation Just Cause in Panama and reported from Baghdad in the weeks before the start of Operation Desert Storm. She won the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the National Defense for her series, The Proconsuls. Here in San Francisco, old friend Sam Kean, who describes himself as overeducated at Harvard and Princeton, who's taught at Boston University, Douglas, Princeton University, and was the visiting professor of medical ethics at the University of Florida. He's been a contributing editor of Psychology Today from 1969 to 1989, published many books, videos, and audio tapes, including Fire in the Belly on Being a Man and Learning to Fly, The Trapeze, Fear, Trust, and the Joy of Letting Go. Next to him, Norman Soloman, nationally syndicated columnist on media and politics. He writes the media beat for the Cleveland Plain Dealer and has published op-ed pieces in numerous newspapers, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, and the International Herald Tribune. He's the executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, a nationwide consortium of public policy experts scrutinizing media releases from major think tanks. He's appeared on many television shows and was responsible for Sean Penn's trip to Iraq. And our last episode of the Active Opposition featured an interview with Sean just back from that trip. He's the author of many books, including Through the Media Looking Glass, a counterpoint to the myth of liberal media. Tonight, we'll begin by exploring the politics of fear. It's no doubt that Americans are living in fearful times. Fear of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction and fear of more terrorist attacks like the tragedy of September 11th. The conjunction of these two anxieties have elevated sentiments of fear throughout the country. Let's start by exploring the following questions. If there's a threat, why is the perceived threat viewed so differently by us and our allies? Let's start with Dana.
Well, I think the answer to that is the threat by its very nature is difficult to judge, and it's circumstantial in some aspects. So if you look at, for instance, Secretary Powell's presentation to the United Nations, you can see what they try to put on the table in terms of concrete evidence But ultimately, you have to either buy the evidence or you have to dismiss it because it's not the actual anthrax in a bottle sitting in somewhere in Iraq. And you also have to then make a judgment call on the intention of Saddam Hussein in this case. As the administration is arguing, he is procuring weapons and has an intention to use them sometime in the future, if not with himself, by himself, then with a network of terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda. That link is a key to this issue, and when the link between Al-Qaeda and Iraq is key here, Secretary Powell and others have tried to lay out the link. They've done that with Mr. Sakari, who sought medical care in Baghdad and then is still in Iraq but probably not in Baghdad, and other members of the Al-Qaeda organization who are in Iraq in the north in a plant that we don't know a lot about but is described as a poison plant. As I say, it's a circumstantial link because they have not produced the infamous smoking gun. And the allies who don't agree with the action vis-a-vis Iraq now must conclude that Saddam Hussein's intention is not immediate. It's not worth using military force at this time to counter. I think there are those in the administration who don't want to wait until that time when they have clear evidence because their case is that it will be too late.
Well, you've let
I
us
think they're trying to put the best face on circumstantial evidence by not calling it circumstantial and by presenting it in a way that looks as factual and specific and definite as they can. But people judge that for what it is, and many people are arguing over those little pieces of evidence that we do have.
Let's remind ourselves of the administrative position just a minute. I'll get back to the guests. In his last press conference, President Bush reiterated the specific link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, the link that many of Bush's international opponents say has not been satisfactorily proven. Let's look at that tape now.
Saddam Hussein is not disarming. This is a fact. It cannot be denied. Saddam Hussein has a long history of reckless aggression and terrible crimes. He possesses weapons of terror. He provides funding and training and safe haven to terrorists. Terrorists who would willingly use weapons of mass destruction against America and other peace-loving countries. Saddam Hussein and his weapons are a direct threat to this country, to our people, and to all free people. If the world fails to confront the threat posed by the Iraqi regime, refusing to use force, even as a last resort, free nations would assume immense and unacceptable risks. The attacks of September the 11th, 2001, showed what the enemies of America did with 4 airplanes. We will not wait to see what terrorists or terrorist states could do with weapons of mass destruction. We are determined to confront threats wherever they arise. I will not leave the American people at the mercy of the Iraqi dictator and his weapons. Iraq is a part of the war on terror. Iraq is a country that has got terrorist ties. It's a country with wealth. It's a country that trains terrorists, a country that can arm terrorists. And our fellow Americans must understand in this new war against terror that we not only must chase down Al-Qaeda terrorists, we must deal with weapons of mass destruction as well.
He's stolid, he's sound. Is he convincing? Norman, is there really a link, any tangible evidence between 9/11 and Iraq?
It's not really there. I mean, even the White House doesn't make the claim that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. And the assertions about links to Al-Qaeda, I think, are actually weaker than could be made towards regimes in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. I think a lot of what's involved is that 9/11 was taken by this administration to be a sense of blank check. Another way to put it is that 9/11 was interpreted and promulgated as a license to kill. That the United States government now has the prerogative to strike first against any potential or projected threat sometime in the future. Well, once you open that door, you can put anything through it. You can move any kind of armaments, you can wage any kind of war. And the question that really, I think, has yet to be joined and confronted in our own society in widespread public debate is, what are the implications of this? What kind of world will we live in if the assertion of a future threat justifies an attack? One of the many ironies that go unremarked, and I think quite often our U.S. news media in the mass media sense are kind of irony-free zones. If it's an unauthorized irony, you can't go there, is that by the very standards proclaimed by the U.S. government and the White House in particular, Saddam Hussein would have more than enough ample justification to have attacked Washington long ago, because the evidence of the U.S. being prepared, ready, willing, and eager to attack Iraq, that evidence is much stronger than any supposed documentation of Iraq being a threat to the United States. And yet, of course, that is impossible to fathom or imagine, because the meaning of saying this is the world's only superpower is that we are the world's biggest bully, we run the show, and when you strip away all the rhetoric, you have the assertion that might makes right. That's really the underpinning. There's one thought I had in particular on that note when we were watching the clip of the recent unusual Bush primetime press conference. There was a voice missing from that press conference. Helen Thomas, who for many, many years, decades, as the dean of the White House press corps, could ask the first question. Not only was she not allowed to ask the first question, she wasn't even recognized or called upon in that scripted, literally scripted news conference. And I think that's quite symbolic, because at the daily briefings with Ari Fleischer at the White House, Helen Thomas has asked those almost unaskable questions, like, what is the threat? And she did it again.
I've read them.
Afterwards, she said to Ari Fleischer, what is the threat to the United States of America from Iraq? This was just a couple of days ago. And Ari Fleischer replied, well, the Iraqis are a threat to U.S. troops in the region. And so you have then this formulation, which I think in a way summarizes it all. The White House is saying that, yes, Saddam Hussein threatens American troops that have been deployed to surround and attack Iraq.
I'd like to read you a little poll result, and then I'd like to ask Professor Saeed and Sam the same question, because I think they might approach it from different perspectives. In autumn of 2002, CBS took a poll, and 51% of the American people felt that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. And a few days later, the Pew Research Center took the same poll, and 66% of the people believed that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11. Professor Saeed, do you think that this is because these are Middle Eastern people, that they appear strange to us? I'm curious for your thoughts on this.
Going back to the question about link, there is definitely a link, and the link is fear.
Is fear?
That's the link. The link is fear. A whole environment of fear was created. 9/11 was an event of destruction, but equally 9/11 was an event of the creation, the emergence of a new consciousness. So when you raise the question, for me, what happens in 9/11, we reacted, most of us, to 9/11 out of relationship, not in relationship. And when we react out of relationship, we isolate. So when you ask the question, was there a link? Yes. Middle Easterners, not one single Iraqi was involved in 9/11. In fact, not one single proof has been given about 9/11. Now, of course, when Arabs look at 9/11, their initial reaction was denial. It couldn't be us. It must be Mossad. They kept saying that. And a friend of mine asked me the question, said, why is it that way? I said, because what happens is similar to the Israelis. When Israeli armed forces destroy houses, Palestinian houses, the response of many Israelis say, look here, we hate doing this. They make us do it. In both cases, what Arabs are saying and what Israelis are saying, they are embracing their pain. And by embracing their pain, they want to deny that they are involved in it. So when you ask the question about how Arabs react, definitely said for them, initially it was denial. They say, we couldn't do it. My God, it's totally inconsistent with Islam, with Arab traditions. As Israelis, when they react to the destruction of Palestinian homes, they deny it because it's also inconsistent with their own traditions. So the link is fear, definitely. The link is fear. And what the president has done about that, the president, when initially you asked the question, Abdana, about the threat for Arabs, Muslims, and many non-Americans, the president's message is mixed, incoherent, oftentimes contradictory. On the one hand, President Bush talks about Islam is a religion of peace. On the other hand, Muslims and Arabs in the United States, their charities are questioned, their income taxes are questioned. They say, hey, wait a little, what's going on here? On the one hand, the president visits our mosques, and then we are constantly profiled at airports. Many of the Arab and Islamic charities are under attack. And furthermore, when we talk about threat, you asked the question earlier, oftentimes we Americans, and I have lived in the United States more than 50 years, I have 2 born and bred American sons, I have an American granddaughter, an American wife, so I've lived here more than 50 years. What is oftentimes absent from our discourse is that others feel threatened by us. Others feel threatened by our colossal power. So when you ask about threat,
That's the rationale.
there's another way of looking at that threat.
That's the rationale of tonight's show. Sam, I see you nodding and nodding and nodding here.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to take off from what Dr. Saeed said. You know, psychologists make a distinction between fear and anxiety. And I think our problem in this country is not fear, it's anxiety, and it stems from 9/11. Something happened that we don't have any needles to knit this on. And so for the first time, we don't know where the threat is coming from. And I think that changes everything. I think we have to take very seriously the feelings that we have. Everybody I know wakes up every morning and they say, this can't be happening. This is surreal. We'll wake up from this dream. And we see these things on television. 66% of the people believe this connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam. We have to say it's true. It's true, but where is it true? It's true in the psyche. Something in the psyche, it's very easy to convince people that, and it's because of the anxiety that we're not dealing, this is not real politic. This is some kind of you know, I think it was Hostetler said, talked about the American style of paranoid politics. This is the same thing over again. And it's why we can't deal with this as if it's a rational happening. It's not rational. You ask, well, is there evidence? No, there isn't evidence. So where is this event happening? The event is happening at some kind of unconscious level. You know, James Joyce said, history is a nightmare from which we're trying to awaken. So what is this nightmare? And it goes back to, I mean, you see it in George Bush. He's, in some sense, he was a perfect character sent from central casting to make us dream this dream. He's a person who believes in his own divine mission. He's a person who believes that the world is divided between good and evil. And he believes that so strongly that he must wake up every morning and not see what the real political situation is in a world where almost everybody is against this kind of intervention, and where you can take somebody who is, let us say, relatively evil, as I think Saddam Hussein is, and turn it into what is a crusade, and turn it into this kind of nightmare. And the essence of what we try to do psychotherapeutically is always, we try to take people from a state of anxiety into a state of fear. Because if you say, well, I don't know where the threat's coming from, it seems to be coming from everywhere. If we can ask ourselves, where are we really threatened? There are a lot of threats that this country faces right now in terms of petroleum shortage really does threaten the American way of life unless we're willing to go to sustainable energy policies, which nobody seems to be willing politically to go to. So I think there's an enormous anxiety that comes as our way of life is threatened, as we look at the world in which we live in a mall of affluence, and 2 billion people in the world live on less than $2 a day. And we don't have needles to knit that on, so we just block it out. We block out the real situation of the impending struggle between the haves and the have-nots. And as long as then we can take that, see, and focus it in on somebody who we can make absolute evil. And incidentally, if we can destroy that, then we have a ready supply of oil, and we don't have to question our way of life. So I think we have to deal with it as a dream in a way.
Let me ask you a question before we shift and talk about the fear as opposed to the anxiety. I want to know, who is the we that's sharing the dream? Because I've never seen the country so divided in my lifetime, with millions and millions of people protesting. There was a wonderful quote that Dana had in her new book. We're discussing the Project for a New American Century, which is a document that was written about 10 years ago, which has laid out the strategy of Iraq. And it was put together by a small circle of conservative think tanks and weapons lobbying groups. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, Deputy Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, and Chief Policy Guru Richard Pearl. And they've been pressing this approach for over a decade. Compare and contrast this with former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marine General Albert Zinni, describing these people saying, quote, they just aren't connected to the world. Thank God for the State Department. Pearl, a paper cut was his biggest scrape, end quote. So obviously there's a schism in reality here.
Is.
You know, what did he mean, Dana?
Well, he meant that there were other threats out there that were more imminent. But he did not take Saddam Hussein as a non-threat. And I guess I feel like I need to interject here just a little bit, because Iraq is a target for many reasons, but certainly it is causing a lot of people to question the sincerity of the effort, because there are a lot of things that are horrible about the Iraqi regime, and some of them have to do with history and his aggression against Kuwait and treatment of his own people that is well documented and really not disputed by people if they look into it, and Saddam Hussein's effort to acquire weapons of mass destruction. What he still has on hand and what he intends to use against the United States is one thing, but his efforts to acquire certain types of material to put those things together, I don't think that that's something that is in great dispute. The stage at which it's at is in great dispute. And I don't think they just pulled it out of the hat as a threat in the, axis of evil argument that they made. All those regimes sponsor terrorism and anti-American feeling to some degree, and they all are developing, and as we know, are further along than Iraq, actually, in both North Korea and Iran, weapons of mass destruction. The fear factor that I think is so important here is that we are dealing with what is called in military terms an asymmetric threat, which our tanks and our fighter jets have no way of defeating, really. Asymmetry means that it's the hardest thing to defeat is the enemy who uses the small network of barefoot people without a lot of means and not a lot of encrypted technology. It's very basic, and it's very hard for the U.S. military to confront. And therefore, it's hard to do away with or contain. And I think partially what drives President Bush and people who do see Iraq as a threat can't imagine being able to contain it. And what is so sticks in the mind of a lot of people is this use of the image of a vial of anthrax or poison. And it is true that with a vial you can do a lot, and it's also true that you cannot find a vial with the U.S. military's overwhelming force. And so that is a very frightening thing, and it's a very real thing. And again, it gets back then to this judgment call about intention. Is it Saddam Hussein's intention to use these weapons not only against his own people, as he has done, but against the United States or his neighbors? And that's where you'll get a lot of dispute about, look at his record in the past years and the fact that he hasn't actually moved across his borders. But other people will say that he now feels pushed to the wall with U.S. policy. In fact, the CIA said, pushed to the wall with regime change, he is now more likely to use weapons of mass destruction or put them in the hands of terrorist organizations who can use them against the United States.
Dana?
So I think the threat is makes people very afraid because it is so hard to confront, it's so hard to find, and it's so hard to defeat ultimately with a conventional military force, which we've come to rely on and come to have some assurance as a nation that it will defend the United States. And it can't truly defend the United States by the nature of this asymmetric weapons of mass destruction threat.
Well, you've put your finger on Sam's notion of fear, and I want to get to this. The linchpin of the administration's argument is the threat to the Middle East and the U.S. from Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Here's Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in a recent address at the Hoover Institute.
If you go to organizations like Jane's and others that look at militaries in various countries, they, and drop a plumb line through everyone's best guess. First of all, it's a closed society, so there's a great deal that people don't know. But the guess is that it's something under 50% of what its capability was in 1991 during the Gulf War in terms of conventional capability. Full stop. With respect to chemical, biological capabilities, one knows that they have advanced, and they are, in my judgment, probably more lethal and dangerous today than they would have been back in '91, but I don't know that for sure. I don't think anyone does, except the Iraqis.
Norman, you signaled me.
Yeah, what is most powerful quite often about a worldview is the assumptions that aren't even stated or questioned. I mean, when we talk about Iraq trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction as though that convicts them of being an enormous threat that must be countered with a military attack, that implicitly just assumes that it's okay, for instance, for the United States to have thousands of nuclear weapons. It ignores what Richard Butler, who was very friendly to Washington when he was head of the UNSCOM UN inspection team, has remarked upon after he left that job and went back to Australia. He said, the most difficult job I had was to go to Baghdad and explain to the leaders of the Iraqi government how terrible it was to try to have weapons of mass destruction when down the road Israel has 200 nuclear bombs. Well, this is almost off the table to talk about. If you're a reporter for the New York Times, Washington Post, or dozens of other major media outlets, that's just A-OK. The assumption is Israel having 200 nuclear bombs? No problem. It's all right for the United States to basically not only accept that, but encourage it. But woe be unto any regime that crosses swords with, rhetorically or any other way, the U.S. government. So I think we have almost an Orwellian double, quadruple backflip standard here that is so pervasive in the U.S. news media that we have skewed our own perception of the world. And it comes down to whether or not the United States is going to set the rules and say, do as we say, not as we do. It's okay for Israel, Turkey, Morocco, Indonesia to violate dozens and dozens of UN Security Council resolutions. But if we decide that our country of choice to bomb is Iraq, then we are up on our holy pedestal, our holy high horse and tabernacle, and we say, we are going to smite the evildoers. Well, I think people around the world, they're not stupid, generally speaking, and they understand that sort of do as we say, not as we do message is the height of hypocrisy. I think in March of 2003, that's where we are. And to take one example out of many, the double standard is so perverse that if you look at the U.S. news media, the supposed finest newspapers, endless discussion about how the Kurds in Iraq have been oppressed, killed by Saddam Hussein. Now that's very true, and I've been to Iraq. I have no defense of that horrible regime of Saddam Hussein. But if you go across the border, Kurdish people in Turkey have been subjected to horrible ethnic cleansing, massacres, destructions of thousands of villages, and I would sum it up this way. As long as the U.S. news media and the policymakers in Washington say that a Kurd who is slaughtered inside the borders of Iraq is a person who we grieve for and must avenge, and a Kurd who is slaughtered by the U.S. ally Turkey on the Turkish side of the border is not worth a single tear because who gives a damn, and Turkey's part of NATO, and Turkey is a U.S. ally, then where we've gone is an intellectual and emotional hypocrisy so deep and so compromising of our own humanity that I really worry about the basic integrity of not only of the people in Washington, but the mainstream journalists who report on them.
Norman, we have a question from Indiana. Eric, go ahead.
In the president's speech that he gave, he talked about the ability of, us to let the flower of democracy bloom in Iraq. And when I think about 1953, we had the freely elected government of Iran, and the United States and Britain got together and they assassinated Mossadegh and stuck the Shah in. And I think about that flower of democracy that just because we didn't like it, we stepped in and we stopped it because they wanted to nationalize the oil fields. And then I see him calling for a flower of democracy in Iraq, and it just bothers me that there's no end game for the Iraqi policies. Where do you go when they elect a cleric? Because they've been led by mortal men. They're going to go to their religious base. And it just bothers me that the president doesn't see the end game, that the people will probably elect a cleric because they don't trust their own people.
Well, perhaps the question that's more germane to this argument is why isn't the media reporting on that possibility? Dr. Saeed.
Well, democracy is an indigenous flower that can only grow when deeply rooted in the dreams of a people. It cannot be imposed. The U.S. can't create democracy for Iraq or impose it upon Iraq. But certainly in the case of Iran, in 1953, we supported, well, we created the whole situation to overthrow Mossadegh. Why doesn't media say it? I mean, oftentimes, myself and many others have written articles about democracy, and most recently I sent one to the Washington Post. They wouldn't publish it, in which I questioned the whole proposition that we in the West, we seem to equate between our own liberal form of democracy with the substance of democracy.
Yes,
and we equate one with the other. The form of democracy is cast in the culture of a people, their historical experiences. The substance of democracy is universal, meaning to provide for participation, to make decisions, to provide for protection of dissent, to provide for policy making, a number of other things. So in our case, when we talk about democracy, take Iraq. Iraq is a very good example. And you mentioned the Kurds earlier, and I work with the Kurds. Now, on the one hand, we are concerned about the Kurds of Iraq and how Saddam Hussein gassed them in Halabja back in '88. But on the other hand, we are now negotiating with the Turks to sell the Kurds to compromise the Kurds. Let's face it, that's part of the negotiation with the Turks at this time. Has to do with the Turks wanting, quote unquote, to establish some form of, not protection, but have pretty much a very strong say about what happens to the Kurds. Why doesn't media do it? Our media has, I mean, it depends. If you are talking about New York Times, Washington Post, the big media, when I raise questions with some of my friends about take articles that are published. How many articles are published in the Washington Post or New York Times about peace? Articles that promote the peaceful perspective, the perspective of peace and conflict resolution.
Well,
Not too many.
Let's ask
Not too
Dana.
many.
Dana, do you want to speak up for the Washington Post?
Well, on the narrower question of why isn't the media exploring the unintended consequences or the aftermath of a war, I have to say that I think we are exploring those things. We've raised the possibility, as reporters, we raise it in a certain way. You know, we're right now raising it in the context of how realistic is a post-war Iraq in the framework in which the administration is portraying their plan. What is this plan supposed to look like? To some extent, judging President Bush's rhetoric on democracy versus all his other actions leading up until that moment where he said this was a plan for democracy in the Middle East, well, all his actions, of course, would not have led you to that conclusion, because nowhere else in the Middle East is he pushing that program, nor has he done that in the past. I think we've pointed that out. But I think in terms of the unintended consequences and the real problems that will confront the military straight on in Iraq right after they are in the war fight, I think we've raised all sorts of questions about it. The longer term, or the more broad question of who will then perhaps take over in Iraq, you hear that among the pundits who are talking about a longer term. I think in our daily coverage, we tend to be, especially in moments of crises where so much is happening, we tend to be a little more short-sighted and immediate in our coverage of daily events, and then leave the opinion sections and the outlook sections to people who are looking a little bit more further down the road. And that's where you do get the debate about, is this realistic, and what are the possibilities that you might actually create democracy? And what's the record for him having tried to do that in the Middle East up till now? So I do think there's such a big difference between the big media, as he said, and most television and regional papers, which don't approach any of these subjects in depth.
Well, actually, Norman is just shaking his head.
I am.
I was trying to get back on another point, but I can't resist you, Norman.
Well, you know, it's the tradition that is still followed of mainstream journalists to talk about, when they discuss policymakers in Washington, unintended consequences. But that shifts it continually to issues of tactics. You know, the people in the White House may be, under that framework, they may be inept, they may be unskilled, but they can't be pernicious, they can't be, if you will, destructive of human rights as a matter of policy. If you look actually, though, at intended consequences, let's take one example. The President of the United States has talked about the torture chambers in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and they certainly are there and they're reprehensible. Meanwhile, the United States sends billions of dollars a year to Egypt, which has a deteriorating human rights situation in the last 18 months, and where torture is routine as an instrument of governance. Now, journalists may talk about unintended consequences, but the reality is one of the intended consequences of U.S. foreign policy is to buttress the regime in Cairo that, as we speak, is torturing people who are political prisoners. Now, until that is put on the agenda of the news media on their own volition, not by waiting until somebody in Foggy Bottom or the White House brings it up, then you have a fourth estate functioning in practical terms more as a fourth branch of government, and that's not acceptable for the kind of democratic discourse that we need.
Okay, we have a call from Texas. Who's calling? Robert?
Robert, yes.
Go ahead.
I appreciate you all doing what you're doing. My comment revolves around our responsibility as a population. Are we willing to sacrifice this opulent lifestyle, even though we struggle with tax time, etc.? We're afraid of a little change. What would it mean to live simply so that others can simply live? We have to confront that, and are we willing to give up this illusion? Despite being anti-war and protesting, are we really that full of conviction that we would make sacrifices? You know, and as far as like our consumerism, that consumes so much of the produced goods in the world, you know, being 6% of the population, can we continue to blindly support or not support a government that is so blatantly interested in capitalism, feeding the frenzy of materialism of its population?
It's a very good question. It's a really germane question, and I want to ask Sam, was signaling me to answer it.
Well, one of the things that appalls me most is our unwillingness to look at the calculus of this in terms of either the moral cost or really the economic cost. I mean, look at the estimates that are given of the economic cost. Some in Washington say, oh, it could be $100 billion. $100 billion when we've already promised 27 to Turkey if they come along, and Israel wants 16. No, all the way to $1.9 trillion. Those are the estimates that I've heard. The estimates in terms of life, what Norman says, it's horrendous. I mean, what Desert Storm, we don't know how many people we're responsible for. I hear figures everywhere from 300,000 to 1,500,000. Harvard Medical School said that over 300,000 children would die following the bombings of the water purification plant and the infrastructure. And now we're talking, I mean, I woke up yesterday morning just in horror. I said, 3,000 bombs are going to be dropped in the first night of this new offensive. And what do they show us in terms of weapons of mass destruction today, or was it yesterday? I forget. We have a demonstration of a 21,000-pound bomb, something that's only slightly sub-nuclear. And to me, the kind of rational way that the press and everybody else is talking about this without any kind of deep moral outrage, what am I going to do as an American? I remember Albert Camus said, I would like to be able to love my country and love justice. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to wake up next Monday as somebody who loves this country, and I'm not going to love it. I'm going to have blood on my hands, and so does everybody else. And this is what bothers me, you know, that we don't have an active opposition which is large enough in moral terms. We're still talking strategy. I don't want the blood of that many people on my hands. That's not a risk worth taking. I can't. At what level do we say, no matter what the risk, we can't do this? We can't enter that. Can we enter into like with the MAD policy with mutual assured destruction with the Soviet Union? Can we risk that kind of moral genocide? And our weapons are genocidal. They're not specific weapons. Just can we risk that? Can we go there as a people? What risks are we willing to take to live in some way that we can honor ourselves?
I understand. You know, before we leave the politics of fear and move into the politics of compassion, I'm trying to keep these braids clear, and the questions and the callers take us in unprecedented ways. But I want to counter Rumsfeld's quote with just a few random quotes from Scott Ritter, who's a Marine, a Republican, Chief UNSCOM inspector for 9 years. He has a new book. I'm just going to read a couple of quotes. Iraq simply lacks the stocks of chemical and biological agents needed to have any militarily significant effect. Iraq has destroyed 90 to 95% of its weapons of mass destruction. The Vice President has been saying that Iraq might be 2 years away from building a nuclear bomb. Unless he knows something we don't, that's nonsense. If Iraq was producing weapons today, we'd have definitive proof, plain and simple. And in his book, his interview with William Rivers Pitt, He talks about the sophisticated testing equipment, the lasers that can sniff out a molecule of sarin, or the Geiger counters, or the heat imprints. So here's a man who's been there for 9 years, and the core of the fear argument to me revolves around the question of, is there a physical threat, or is this entire thing manufactured to generate the kind of anxiety you're talking about so that rational discourse won't take place? Anyone?
Well, you know, I think Danica wrote a story, if I remember correctly, in the Post this morning about even the FBI perhaps looking into the forgery of this document that purported, and we were told for quite a while, to show that Iraq was going shopping for enriched uranium in Niger. We've had this month after month claim from the U.S. that the aluminum tubes had something to do with seeking to build nuclear weapons. Al-Baradei at the UN a few days ago debunked both of those. He called the Niger document a forgery. We've had a long list of accusations and claims from the U.S. government being debunked by UNMOVIC, by Blix in some cases, by Al-Baradei and others. And I think in a sense the U.S. government has profoundly in the last year worked back from its conclusion, which is it's time to go to war. We have a timeline. In that sense, the news media largely have been reporting on a charade to go through the UN, to go through the algorithms, but at the end of the day, and you know, in the book I co-wrote, Target Iraq, we went to press months ago and said, this war is a done deal, and the rhetoric is just that. It's window dressing for dropping the bombs.
Dana,
can I interject
yes, please.
here? You know, I wish I had his crystal ball, because I just don't think it's that clear cut. I don't think you can say this is a done deal. I think these are really tough decisions, and that they are not made. I mean, lots of people think that you know, he had an intention all along to do this, but I think things are just much more complicated than that, and you can't assume that you know everything that's going on. I also have to say, since you did talk about military tactics for a minute, the cost of war is overwhelming in terms of human cost, but to put it in a different perspective than the one that's presented, the United States military has made huge efforts in the last years to concentrate on precision bombing and precision missiles, and they're going to be used in greater extent than ever before in this war, certainly more than 1991. You can look at that for various ways. I think the pressure on the government to reduce collateral damage, to reduce civilian casualties has worked. People should take credit for that and make sure it continues to work, and that the Air Force in particular has made strides, not only for its own reasons, but because of that pressure to create weapons, not including the 21,000-pound bomb, but to create a lot of precision-guided munitions that will have the effect, hopefully, of reducing the number of civilians who are killed. And on the other side, you have Saddam Hussein, who has a history of using humans as shields, not the voluntary human shields, but using women and children, placing them in harm's way in ministries and other things. So I just need to point that out, because I don't think the direction of the military is wholesale civilian deaths. I think the direction, a healthy one, a good one, resulting of pressure, is to go in the opposite way,
well,
and
with
this war will be intended for that is intended to minimize civilian casualties. But it won't, it won't work. There will be civilians who die, and that's a great cost.
In the first place, I think that we should stop, and journalists should stop using the euphemism of collateral damage and talk about the killing and the slaughtering of innocent people. And we've gone, and we also ought to talk about the cowardliness of the military. We're trying something that's never been tried before in human history, to go to war where we slaughter thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people with no loss to ourselves. In Desert Storm, there were fewer people lost on our side, it was something like 80 some odd, than there were in the streets of Detroit in that time. And our quote, precision weapons is the American style of trying to kill from such a direction that we don't have to see what we're doing, And we can use nice things like, oh, they're precision-guided weapons. And this is all euphemism. This is all euphemism. Those weapons are so we don't have to look at the consequences of what we do up close. Up close, the Vietnam veterans who came back and saw war up close were very different than those who came on bombers from Guam and laid their bombs from 20,000 feet up. So I think that we have to stop this kind of antiseptic, amoral way of talking about war and break up this myth of precision weapons and of clean killing. Maybe we should, if we want to go in there and do democracy and we really want to respect those people, maybe we should have to say, are the American people willing to take the kind of risks where we will fight, where we will risk men and women coming home in body bags in order to bring democracy to those countries? If we do, then maybe we have a greater moral right than doing this from above where it costs us nothing except money.
Dr. Saeed, did you want to respond to this as well?
Yes. When Danny was talking, we heard similar talk, not exactly identical, during the Gulf War. And the result was we had casualties. We had some real high casualties. But again, what Sam Kean said is extremely important. Those of us who have lived in wars, and I have lived with bombs as a child in Syria during World War II. It's not only the killing, but the psychological killing, the emotional killing, what happens to people who, I remember as a child going to elementary school, hearing the bombs. We couldn't sleep for days. We had nightmares. So when we talk about that, we have to experience what Thomas Merton has spoken about, an awareness of interdependence. And one of the reasons I was attracted to this show was the inclusion of compassion. We have to talk about that too. But definitely when I hear this precision bombing and smart bombs, and I heard that about the Gulf War, yet the results, until today, many people are suffering from that.
Let's talk, thank you for that elegant lead-in, by the way. Let's talk about the second of our three braids. The second argument appeals to the conscience of the American people and calls on us to protect the weak and use our strength to shelter the helpless. Let's listen to how President George Bush framed this issue in his most recent press conference.
We will bring food and medicine to the Iraqi people. We will help that nation to build a just government after decades of brutal dictatorship. The form and leadership of that government is for the Iraqi people to choose. Anything they choose will be better than the misery and torture and murder they have known under Saddam Hussein. Across the world and in every part of America, people of goodwill are hoping and praying for peace. Our goal is peace for our nation, for our friends and allies, for the people of the Middle East.
Now, this appeal, as noble as it is, raises larger and more complex questions. And these questions have not been reviewed in public debate with anything like the exposure their gravity requires. For instance, what, if any, is our responsibility in this state of affairs? What responsibility do we bear for the problems that currently exist in Iraq? Anyone?
Well, one aspect that we have is what has occurred in the last 12 years. I mean, we heard a lot of assurances about the efforts to prevent the suffering of civilians. And after the war ended, there was and has continued to be a concerted policy of the U.S. government, as documents make clear, as shown by Thomas Nagy, a professor at George Washington University, in an article in the Progressive magazine about a year ago, that it was the policy of the U.S. government to bomb water treatment facilities, sewage plants. The targets were the health of children, together with sanctions, but you can even set aside the sanctions. And I visited bombed water treatment facilities on the Tigris River. And the reality is that kills children. Together with the sanctions, it was a pincer. Bomb those water treatment facilities and then deprive the country of the importation of chemicals and equipment to purify the water. That's killing children. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Go to the transcripts of CBS program 60 Minutes in May of 1996, when then U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, was interviewed by Leslie Stahl. And she was asked, Albright was asked, as a representative of the U.S. government, what about the information coming out of UNICEF already because of U.S.-led sanctions? 500,000 children, 500,000 Iraqi children dying as a result. And what did that representative of the U.S. government say? Well, it's troubling, but, quote, we think it's worth it. Now that kind of moves aside the kind of public relations work that too often journalists do for the Pentagon to kind of pretty up and airwick the stench of the slaughter being paid for by U.S. taxpayers. We think it's worth it. Let's be straight with the American people what's involved with that war and the war to come.
Actually, the Department of Defense has declassified documents that I found cruising the internet once, which were the mock-ups of that attack before it occurred, where they speculated that the destruction of the water systems and the embargo of chlorine would produce the amount of deaths. And their estimate was 500,000 as well. Dana, you're not being attacked, certainly, but do you want to speak up as a representative of the press?
Okay. I don't think that Madeleine Albright meant that that it was worth killing children. The whole point of the sanctions was to put pressure on Saddam Hussein to do a whole host of things, most prominently to leave. And that hasn't worked, and the sanctions are very costly to human life, and they're very unpopular, and a lot of people think they should be done away with, or some other. When Powell came into office, he talked about more pinpoint or precise sanctions. I don't think the U.S. government has done a very good job in figuring out, if it's possible, how to do that. But there's no question that the sanctions have had a devastating effect on the Iraqi population. We've had reporters who have been on the ground trying to figure out how that, not only the sanctions and their effect, but also the effect of years of the no-fly zone bombings that have been happening, which I called several years ago a war in and of itself. It's hard to get on the ground because the Iraqis weren't giving visas out, certainly. But we have had reporters who have done that. So I think this low-grade kind of attack on Iraq has not worked. And there are people last month I heard a scholar from the Air Force Air War College talk about the fact that sanctions have actually killed many more civilians than the war did. And I think a lot of people are well aware of that, and it's not a successful policy in any way.
We have a call from Vermont. Who's calling?
Angela.
Angela, what's your question? Hi.
Hi. I was just wondering why your panel thinks that the media is drumming the beat of war, warning us about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction on one hand and practically advertising the Moab bomb on the other. I was just wondering what...
You wonder why the panelists think that? Norman, why do you think that?
Well, you know, I always hesitate, and actually I don't want to try to imagine the inner psychology of human beings because we really don't know. I think as media critics, if you will, we can go to content and we can see what is emphasized again and again and what gets short shrift. You know, any advertising executive knows that the essence of propaganda is repetition. And so you can find some very good reporting in many newspapers and even broadcast networks, but it is the drumbeat, it's the message time and time again that has the effect of shaping to a significant degree public opinion. And that is largely driven out of Washington. When I was in Baghdad in September and December and in January of this year, I talked to many journalists, and some of them really indicated strongly to me that the overlay of their reporting in totality was shaped in Atlanta, in Washington, and New York back home. And it's a very politicized, and I would say largely Washington-driven tone. And so the emphasis, what is punched up again and again as being important for us to be aware of, that's coming out of the political power centers. And when there is not a significant division within or between the two major political parties on Pennsylvania Avenue, then we get more and more a news media that serve largely as a conveyor belt for official opinion out of Washington.
Well, Robert McChesney, in his book, Rich Media, Poor Democracy, points out that usually there's never any major disagreement in war because it never hurts any of the major classes, manufacturing class, military, industrial class, because they all make money. So there tends to be a kind of alignment between media and industry in that case. As you were talking, I was thinking that originally the UN Resolution 687 in April of '91 specified that once Iraq complied, the sanctions would be lifted. But in the next month, in May of '91, the first George Bush said, quote, "At this juncture, we don't want to lift these sanctions as long as Saddam Hussein is in power." And in case we thought it was an accident, the same day Secretary of State James Baker said, "We're not interested in seeing a relaxation of sanctions as long as Saddam Hussein is in power." And then in October of this year, of 2002, when Iraq was trying to decide whether to let inspectors in the palace, Ari Fleischer talked about the cost of one bullet being cheaper than the cost of an invasion. So my question is, what was Saddam Hussein's incentive to comply with disarmament? He's being told for the last 12 years that no matter what he does, the United States wants him out. Anyone?
Well, it's a key point. We've had this myth that if only Saddam Hussein would comply comply with the resolutions out of the UN and demands being articulated out of Washington, the sanctions would be lifted. But as the quotes you cite make clear, and there are many others as well, there's been a continuity of actual policy enunciated by three administrations now, quite the opposite. Whatever he did, he was told that the sanctions would remain in place. And of course, he's not the one who suffered. We know that. My analysis would be that the Hussein regime has actually been strengthened by the sanctions. It's soldered and bonded the people there, many of whom hate him for good reason, to the regime itself. And I mentioned to viewers that if they want details on exactly the history of that sanctions policy, go to the Institute for Public Accuracy website, which is www.accuracy.org. It's there in all the grim detail.
Let's see what Harold from Connecticut wants to ask.
The Iraqis have not lived up to any of the sanctions. Do you really think that Saddam would be having the inspectors in there if the U.S. didn't have troops there?
Do I think that?
Yes.
Well, I think if there was not a United Nations, probably not. Dana?
Well, I don't really follow the logic of the last question. I don't think Saddam Hussein has a motivation to disarm because he wants to have those weapons, and he's not part of the world community in any significant way, and doesn't seem to care much about that. But I also would like to go back to the question about the news media that you brought up right before that, and why is it that we shovel this stuff out and there's not great debate. And, you know, I do think that the lack of debate within a two-party system or having a real opposition party does mean that you get you get less of a debate. And that, to just explain how I see it, part of our function as journalists in Washington is to give the public as unfiltered as we can, the view from the White House, the view from Congress, the view from the Pentagon, and so that people can decide for themselves whether they're telling the truth. Our other function is to question that. When you don't have someone in Congress, for instance, I'll just pick an example, standing up and questioning the whole Iraq business, then you have a one-sided flow of information from the White House. It's a very controlled White House. They're fairly disciplined. It's very difficult to report on any of the internal disputes. It really is. We picked away at that at the Pentagon in a much better way. But as a result, you have had, I think, part of our function is to pass along what the administration, what its argument is, and then to also look into that. But the passing along of that is part of our, I think, fundamental job, and the lack of a real democratic opposition in Congress, for instance, in committees where you would have these sorts of disputes and debates going on. The fact that you haven't had that does mean that we've reported it less.
Well, you know, and as an example, for instance, Robert Byrd recently gave a speech, and it was widely reported all over the internet. I can't tell you how many copies of it I got on my computer, and it came many times. I never saw it in a major daily, and it was an articulate and impassioned wake-up call to the United States saying that we are going down the wrong path in history. And I mean, when people like myself know you, and I know other reporters and editors and know them to be people of integrity and discerning intellect, it's not like we hold you responsible for the decisions of your editors. But stepping back, when it seems that the internet provides us with an unfiltered view to dissent and articulate arguments from all over the world, it's hard not to feel that our own homegrown media is not sorely lacking in balance in giving us the information and the data necessary to make informed decisions. I wanted to ask Dr. Saeed something because he mentioned...
Let me make a comment
before
please
that.
I agree with Dana about her analysis of Washington and Congress. But media, however, has trivialized dissent and opposition. I'm not talking about within the party system, but anytime we look at how media is covering opposition to the war, dissent, it's trivialized. It's not taken seriously. I just want to make that point.
Yes, Sam.
Just to your point, I'm appalled, for instance, that McNeil Lehrer and no major news media ever has Noam Chomsky on. If they want an alternative voice, he's there. He's respectable. He's done his homework. So if there's all this passion to see both sides of it, why do we see it notably absent?
That's why we started the act of opposition. Dr. Saeed, you said something earlier that I would like to pursue, where you talked about the necessity to inculcate democracy, that it's not something that can be imposed. And I'm wondering, there's a funny inconsistency here. We're talking about imposing democracy in Iraq, or at least removing the impediments to it so that it can flower. I'm wondering, is this a singular principle of American policy? Is this like the Supreme Court ruling on the last presidential election, that this is a one-time case only? We're not setting case law? Or is this the beginning of a policy, the announcement to the world, that now we're going to begin removing the impediments to democracy around the world?
Well, we hear, in Washington, we hear many voices. We hear other voices saying that Iraq may be just the beginning. And you hear that in the Middle East, whether Iraq is, because when we talk about Iraq now, when we hear voices about Iraq and the Ba'ath Party, we hear a plan to achieve de-Ba'athification. And of course, once you do that, then you have to de-Ba'athify the party in Syria. And once you do that, you have to do others. So I don't think there is a coherent approach there. But to go back to Iraq, I have been asked to, for a few months, to be an external resource person to the Democratic Principles Working Group in the Department of State, working with the Iraqi opposition. And I have been very impressed with ideas emanating from Iraqis themselves. These are highly accomplished Iraqis. Many are most professionals, physicians, lawyers, doctors, journalists, authors, and they have come with many ideas. But they too have told the U.S. government that they welcome support from the United States, but they want to be able to do it themselves. They don't want an American general. They don't want an American imposition on them of a system. Unfortunately, what has happened with the Democratic Principles Working Group of the Department of State, we have seen then the emergence of other groups within the Department of Defense. And America is not speaking with one voice on that. From what I can see at this time, beyond phase one, which is the military, there isn't really much consensus on phase two, 3, or phase 4.
Well, just as a cursory student, one wonders, when they say democracy, most Americans think of democracy like our own, which is a winner-take-all democracy. But a parliamentary system is a different kind of democracy, proportional voting. The majority of Iraq, as I remember, are Shiites, no? Who are...
Yes, 60%.
60% who are ideologically aligned with Iran. Would we allow them to democratically vote to have nuclear weapons or to join the government of Iran? I can't imagine that.
Well, that's an important question. What kind of it? In Iraq at this time, 60% are Shia Arabs, Shiites. About 17% are Sunni Arabs, and they are dominating Iraq at this time. The Iraqi government is predominantly Sunni Arabs. And the remaining population are Kurds, predominantly Kurds. There are a few Christians and others, but so the only democracy that would work in Iraq would have to be a federal system. It would have to be different from what Iraq has had in the past. But here again, Turkey, in Washington's discussion with Turkey, Turkey is very sensitive, in fact, very much opposed to a federal system in Iraq for fear that a federal system could end up in a Kurdish state in the north and a Shiite state in the south.
You know,
so that's a very complicated issue.
I understand. The clock is ticking, and so I want to get to the third braid before we run out of time, the politics of hope. Finally, it's asserted that the United States will be able to foster a Western-style democracy in place of the repressive Hussein regime. Again, let's look at how President Bush describes Iraq after U.S. troops depose Saddam Hussein.
I'm convinced that a liberated Iraq will be important for that troubled part of the world. The Iraqi people are plenty capable of governing themselves. Iraq's a sophisticated society. Iraq's got money. Iraq will provide a place where people can see that the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds can get along in a federation. Iraq will serve as a catalyst for change, positive change. I hope we don't have to go to war, but if we go to war, we will disarm Iraq. And if we go to war, there will be a regime change. And replacing this cancer inside of Iraq will be a government that represents the rights of all the people, a government which represents the voices of the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds. We care about the suffering of the Iraqi people. We will be changing the regime of Iraq for the good of the Iraqi people.
Dana, will the overthrow of Saddam Hussein lead to the imposition of a Western-style democracy in Iraq, or will we just get another pro-American strongman who backs the U.S.?
Well, I think this is so much more uncertain than any sort of military fight that there is to be in Iraq. Our history of that in the Balkans in particular, where we have a track record of trying to create a federation in Bosnia and to create a new sort of political system in Kosovo, is not very good. And it's not because people haven't tried hard, and a lot of people with goodwill and good intentions haven't tried hard. In part, it's because we're not very good at the civilian side of things. The military has become so overwhelmingly powerful and can stabilize in the kind of purely tactical ways a lot of violence. But what we aren't good at as a country who says that it cares about transitioning governments is to stand up new political systems. It's very difficult, but we don't even have, and we've never created a civilian core of people who might even attempt to do that in a serious way. There are disparate groups within the UN, humanitarian organizations, and even in the military and their small civil affairs units who who try to do that. And if you look at the Balkans, they have been somewhat successful. They've certainly been successful in the security issues, but they haven't been successful in transitioning those societies or helping them to transition away from political violence into a more stable political system that might be representational of some sort. So you can't even really get off the mark yet with trying to do this, because we don't have the structures out there to even try to make it happen. They claim that they will do that in this case. There's a lot of skeptics who say the history doesn't show that, and they aren't saying much about their so-called plan to hand off the military occupation to any sort of body of people who might have the skill and the translation and the cultural adaptation to be able to do anything as massive as that.
You know, I know, like yourself, Dr. Saeed has spent lots of time on the ground there, and I'm curious, Dr. Saeed, what your best guess is for the way that America and its political systems will be regarded if we have a military invasion of a Middle Eastern country. Has Saddam Hussein really lost status amongst people on the ground, or is he regarded well for having stood up to an overwhelming display of force on the part of the United States? And finally, do you think that a Western-style democracy is something that can flower in a way that we know it in Middle Eastern culture?
Saddam Hussein is not popular among Arabs. So when you say, has he lost ground? He has lost ground a long time ago. Certainly some Arabs may view him as a hero, but he certainly has lost ground and is losing ground. Personally, I am very much connected and acquainted with many Iraqis and many Arabs. In fact, in my meetings with the Iraqi opposition and many Iraqis, they kept telling me, they said, for goodness sake, why don't you tell the other Arabs how we are oppressed, how we are living under a tyrant? They kept saying that. Please, just tell the other Arabs what is going on in Iraq, what is happening to us Iraqis. So I doubt very much if Saddam can gain any ground. Going back to your other questions and building in a way upon Dana's points, militarily, the American position is unlosable. But politically, at this time, it does not appear winnable. That's a very hard situation. We don't have a winnable political situation. When we talk about peace in the Middle East or in Iraq, how does it look like? When we talk about victory, how will victory look like? Now you ask a question about democracy. No bombing has created a democracy. We are not aware of any precedent where bombing has created a democracy. Now, it has to come from within. And of course, there are those who say democracy is incompatible with Islam. That's nonsense. Because many people, when people make the assertion that democracy is incompatible with Islam, they overlook the role that religion has played in our democracy, in Western democracy, in American, the role of Calvinism in the development of democracy, the role of Calvinism, modernization and development. Islam, like any other religion, has precepts that are democratic, precepts that are undemocratic. But when we say democracy and Islam are incompatible, what we are holding up as the standard is our own form of democracy. Having said that, it's not going to be easy. You are right, it's going to be very hard, very complicated, very difficult. Our own democracy took a long time to emerge. Sometimes we forget that, and for the Iraqis, it's going to take a long time. Finally, you asked the question of how will Arabs react and Muslims to an American invasion, an American occupation of Iraq. That is not going to be received well. America, bear in mind, has never had a colonial history in the Middle East, has never had a colonial history with the Muslims or with the Arabs. Britain has had a colonial history, as has France, as has Spain, but not the United States. Russia has had a colonial history with Islam, with Muslims, definitely. So America is now beginning to be perceived as a colonial power. I mean, and at times when the president uses the language he does, when he personalizes, demonizes the whole situation, Arabs and Muslims begin to wonder, is this a crusade? What's going on here? So to go back to your question, I can't even begin to think about consequences of a war in Iraq, an American invasion of Iraq.
Thank you. We have a call. Tom from Florida. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, hello. My question is, how do we view sincerity of President's concern about Iraqi people in regards to being victimized and gassed by the Saddam's regime vis-a-vis the fact that the sanctions actually outnumber the victims vastly, and yet we support them, we impose them, and nothing is done about improving the effectivity of those sanctions.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that so many times we've heard in the media echo chamber of this country, coming from U.S. officials, about how Saddam Hussein gassed his own people. In those instances, and there are so many of them, history is taken to be absolutely crucial to understanding the current situation. And yet, if one is to raise the reality of the Reagan administration's role in tilting towards Iraq, in providing intelligence to help Saddam Hussein to do these horrible deeds in the 1980s, the evidence of providing precursor chemicals. When I was at a meeting with former UN head of the Oil for Food program, Dennis Halliday, and Tariq Aziz, the Deputy Prime Minister, a few weeks ago in late January, we brought a Time magazine with Donald Rumsfeld on the cover, and Aziz chuckled and said, yes, he's quite a warmonger now. He didn't seem that way when he came to visit us in the mid-1980s. All of a sudden, when we bring that up, we're told, oh, that's ancient history, why bring it up now? Well, we can't have it both ways. Either history matters or it doesn't.
I have one question for each of you. I'd like to start with Sam. Is there any hope in this situation? And if so, what is it? I'd like to go around once and close.
Yes, I think there is hope. There is something that we could do that would disarm a great deal of Arab sentiments against the United States. No matter what the country of the Mideast is, when you look at their complaints against us, very near to the center of that is the Palestinian situation and our refusal really to do anything about that. I believe that we have a tremendous opportunity if we would back off Iraq at this point and put the pressure on Israel and the Palestinians to solve that situation. If we want to put a model, if we want a paradigm of democracy in the Mideast, let's do it where we have some real kind of control over the situation. Let's see if we can make it work between Israel and the Palestinians.
Okay, we have a minute for each of you. Norman.
There's hope based on realism, and that is to understand, I think, that the U.S. government is determined to make this war happen, and that only through people calling the situation for what it is can we hope to navigate in a realistic way. And that means challenging this war, understanding the human costs, and exercising our First Amendment rights to stop this war.
Dana, sorry.
Well, I would agree with Sam on this, that we should monitor President Bush's pledge to make the peace process between the Palestinians and Israelis the next thing on his agenda. That's not been what they've done in the past. There's no track record to that, and yet I also think that it is key to a lot of changes in the Middle East that should come, and to terrorism and going back to your fear theory or your fear subject, that would go a long way in bringing peace to the region, and also to diminishing the next generation of terrorists that might want to join the jihad.
And Dr. Saeed, the last word?
Yes, there is hope. 30 million coordinated global protests. That's hope. 30 million people coordinated global protests. That's one hope. Another hope, the United Nations has responded to their task. There's hope there, definitely. The United Nations is actively engaged. We should be feeling good about that. And that was mentioned earlier, yes, let's begin to address the causes of conflict in the Middle East. Let's begin to address them seriously. If we don't, then we'll have more and more problems. But for me, there's hope. There is hope. There's a new consciousness that's emerging. So I'm optimistic.
That's great. And my hope, of course, is in this show and dialogues like this and the time and space for people to speak at length. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank our guests for this evening. Dana Priest, Sam Keene, Abdul Aziz Saeed, and Norman Soloman. We hope that you've learned something by the end of this program which you didn't know when it began.